something like that when events are as popular as this one is. So yeah, like I said, a very warm welcome. We're here for an hour together with Sarah and Sue from Delve, who we've worked with on a significant number of occasions now, and absolutely delighted to have them back with us again. It's always an absolute pleasure. Just a few things from me, please. I think it may have popped up on your screen like it has done on mine, but we are recording this. Sarah said it's been immensely popular, this session, so this recording will go on the HPMA website for other colleagues to access that, so please do share that information widely with your colleagues. We will be sending out evaluations after the session today. My appeal is please do complete that, and with the opportunity on there for you to advise Jo and I of further sessions that you would like. So please do share with us what else you'd like us to make arrangements for, and we'll do our absolute best to do that. And then my final thing is, please just type in the chat box who you are, where you're from. That's really helpful. A few things, it gets your fingers moving again, although it may be you've been on Teams meetings all morning and they might be tired, but an appeal to say who you are and where you're from, because not only is it an opportunity to say hello, but it helps Jo and I as well in terms of logging attendees, because we don't always get the full details when people just sign in, because you may have a different name, etc., that's on your sign in. So that's it from me. I am delighted to hand over to Sarah and to Sue, and I'll see you on the other side. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy, and welcome everybody. I'm Sarah from Delve. I'll tell you a little bit more about Delve and also ask my colleague Sue to introduce herself in a moment. But just a couple of things. I know most people are used to Zoom, but I know you tend to use Teams more than Zoom. So just a couple of quick points to mention. You'll see in the top right-hand corner, there's a view button. When we're sharing any slides, the best option is gallery view or gallery side-by-side view. You'll see it pop up when we share the slides. This means that you can see the slides, but you can also see some faces down the side as well, and you can sort of toggle between the two. There's also the chat function. Lots of people are putting things in the chat, which is brilliant. It is going to be interactive. There are a lot of people, so we're not going to necessarily put you on the spot or ask you to speak up unless you really want to. But we are going to ask you to type stuff in the chat and just have a conversation with us. We'll ask a few questions as we go through, because we're obviously talking about inclusive leadership, but it's an opportunity for you to share some good practice that you might have within your area or your trust that you can share with some of your colleagues that are in the room as well. So we will ask you to type in the chat. I think most people have found in the bottom left, you've got the mute button if you need to mute or unmute, and video button. Please feel free to put your video on if you want to. As I said, we don't mind pets or food or whatever in the background. That's absolutely fine. It's up to you. And then the other thing is, there is an activity where we'll ask you to raise your hand if you've experienced some of the statements on a slide. So just so you know where raise your hand is, at the bottom you'll see a little reactions button. So have a practice. You can raise your hand there just to practice. You do have to lower your hand as well, so you can go back into it. There are some thumbs up signs and other things that you can use as well if you want to. So just have a play around with it. You can't break it. But we do just want you to interact as much as possible, really. So it's just to familiarise you with those areas, really. So let me just share my screen a moment, and we'll test, make sure you can all see that okay. Does that come up okay for everybody?
Yes.
Brilliant, thanks, Sue. So today is very much around a three-pronged approach to inclusive leadership, and that's what we're going to cover today. To tell you a bit more about who Delve are, so I previously worked in the NHS. Some of my colleagues who we used to work with are on today, actually, before setting up Delve in 2017 with my business partner, Nick. We both have backgrounds working within the NHS and also working in the system space as well. And we set up Delve with the premise that we believe work communities should be places where people can thrive. So that's our mission, really. And you can see down the right-hand side, those are our values. And if anyone wants to tweet today, we've obviously got the Twitter handles up there if we've got any avid tweeters. I'll just hand over to Sue, and Sue can do some introductions and we'll take you through the rest of the programme.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being on time and for joining us today. My name is Sue. I'm an occupational psychologist, and I'm very excited to be on this session with you today. Just to tell you a little bit more about what to expect and give you an outline of what we aim to cover, we're going to explore the impact of inclusive leadership We're also going to learn to recognize signs of bias, not only in ourselves, but also in the environments that we work in. And finally, we're going to champion change and delve a little deeper into the skills that we need to develop as an inclusive leader. Does that sound okay to everybody? You can give us a little thumbs up, and please feel free to type in the chat as well if you have any thoughts. But first, we would like to hear from you. So we wanted to get the conversation started by talking about belonging. Have you ever found yourself in a situation at work where you felt like you do not belong? This may have been because of something someone has said or because of someone's actions, whether they intended for it to come across that way and whether they were even aware of the impact that it has had. Compare that feeling to a time where you felt like you did belong and where a situation affirmed your belief and you felt valued. So we'd like for you to maybe type into the chat, or please feel free to come off mute as well, if you have any examples about the importance of feeling like you belong at work and what an impact that can make. I'm just going to open up the chat to make sure that I don't miss anything. I'll give you a moment just to think about the importance. Why is it so important to feel like you belong at work? Yes, the important point there about how it affects not only how you feel at work, but also how you feel about yourself outside work. Feeling like I belong is when I believe my contribution matters and that I have a voice. Psychological safety, and it impacts motivation levels and feeling valued. Thank you. Yes, about feeling energized as well. Thank you. So a lot of themes there about feeling valued and how it impacts the wider circle, right? And this feeling is ingrained in us and it goes back so many years. Reflect on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're almost hardwired to allow a sense of belonging and this feeling of being valued to take precedence over self-esteem and self-actualization. It's called the inclusion paradox. We're all alike, we're all uniquely different, and we are like some people more than others, and we all have this deep-seated need to be included and valued. Inclusive leadership helps to address these two crucial needs, and it enhances performance, collaboration, attendance, and turnover rates. But also it goes much more beyond that. And like you mentioned, it impacts how you feel about yourself. So how do we create this sense of being valued and make people feel like they belong when you have a group of multicultural, diverse people who are fundamentally different from each other? So let's start by understanding it a little bit more. Inclusion and embracing people who are different from us is not a natural act. Inclusive leaders work to understand that unconscious bias is a key factor that we have to manage to practice intentional inclusion. Neuroscience tells us about the physiology that goes on in our brains when we interact and meet someone who is different from us. We almost instantaneously associate similarity with safety and differences to a potential threat. Since the old Stone Age, when man lived in caves, our brains have been trained to constantly scan our environments for threats, scanning and registering every stick as a stake, looking for slight changes in our environments and deciding if it was the wind that made a bush move or a predator to fend from. We've become so great at this today that our brains continue to do so almost subconsciously. So when we meet someone who does not look, talk, or think like us, our brains interpret it as a potential threat, and it goes into a state of stress. Your adrenal glands release the hormone cortisol into your bloodstream, and it all happens in a matter of seconds. We just can't help it. The neural pathways that we use to think about people in groups are similar to what we use when we think about ourselves, causing us to be more empathetic. We use different neural pathways when we think of people who are in our out group, causing us to be more indifferent. So to overcome this reaction, we have to make a conscious effort to recognize and work to overcome these tendencies. So the next time you meet someone who is similar to you, who is from the same hometown and speaks the same way as you, and you hit it off, ask yourself, Is it because you actually made a connection with this person, or is it because you're giving in to your similar to me bias? And we will continue to talk about bias later on. So to summarize, the Randall framework conceptualizes inclusive leadership as a set of leader behaviors that are focused on facilitating group members feeling a part of the group, retaining their sense of individuality, while contributing to the group processes and outcomes. So it kind of summarizes the main themes that you were typing into the chat as well, around that feeling of belongingness, that feeling of being authentic and unique, and the feeling of knowing that you're making a meaningful contribution. I'd like to hand over to Sarah now, just to talk about to reflect on your current reality.
Yes, we want you to make the most of using the chat function. Thank you to those of you that have contributed so far and shared your thoughts in what it means in terms of that feeling of belonging. But we also want you just to have a think about think about your work situation now. How do you problem solve? What are your team meetings like? Are they inclusive? And how are workspaces set up as well? Are they set up in an inclusive way? If you've got some brilliant examples of good practice, please pop it in the chat. We'd love you to sort of share your thoughts around that, because it's really important that we start to think about how some of the practices we have at work can potentially not be all that inclusive. If you think about things like how diverse are your senior leadership teams, for example, think about your promotion or evaluation process. Is that inclusive? How does your team celebrate diverse ideas, and think about how do you feel able to talk about your background without being judged? So there's lots of different things to think about. So please do feel free to pop some thoughts in chat around some of these areas. Think particularly about your meetings as well. Are you really hearing from everybody? Do you find that some voices are potentially heard more than others? Because that can sometimes be the case, really. And so Ursula, you just mentioned there, thank you for sharing that about not working on the day that you have the team meeting. So that can make things really difficult, can't it? And sometimes it's just those small things that sometimes lead us to feeling not as included as we would like. Just the fact that perhaps the meeting's on a different day to the one that you work at. Or, you know, I remember when I worked part-time, a similar situation, discussions or meetings might happen on the day that I was off, and things might have moved on quite quickly. And as a part-time worker, I found it quite hard to kind of keep up with some of that. Another comment in there around lots of big personalities that can overpower. We are doing a session later on around stop talking and start listening, which is very much around some of the nuances and differences between extroverts and introverts. And you're absolutely right. It can sometimes feel like that in meeting, and particularly if you're new into the team, you've got some voices that people that are extroverts that tend to take over a little bit and not always include other people in the team. And that is a lot of the time, it's quite unintentional. People get passionate and want to share their ideas, but that's at the expense of other people in the group. And another comment there just around having a daily huddle. And rotating the chair amongst the whole team to ensure that colleagues who don't normally contribute have the chance to speak. So that's a brilliant example of making sure that everybody's feeling included. Somebody talking about a bit from the north of the city, and we can talk about differences in terms of where we live geographically as well. It's really interesting the way that you can sometimes feel excluded from the discussions, and it is just those micro nudges almost that you tend to notice. And you're absolutely right there, Katie, that extroverts versus introverts, sometimes that confidence is valued over consideration and content. And one of the things that we'll reflect on later is not mistaking assertiveness for a good idea just because someone's speaking the loudest. And it can be quite difficult to do. Working in an agile way as well, and people that are remote working, actually there are lots of biases, and we'll come on to that. But one of those is around that almost distance bias. So if you're not seeing somebody every day, actually there's a potential opportunity that we might be excluding them. So thanks for sharing that one as well. And lots of people started working during COVID when everyone was remote working. I mean, I know COVID's still happening, but whenever a lot of people that weren't front facing or operational were working remotely, and that can be really difficult because you don't get to know everyone as much. So there are lots of things that tend to impact on our own experiences, really. And it's worth just reflecting on some of those. You know, next time you're in a meeting, just watch some of the body language, some of those cues. Think about things like if those informal discussions that you might be having at the start of a meeting are all very important. But as somebody's commented on the chat there, sometimes if you're from a different part or you've not joined in on a social activity, it can feel quite excluding as well. So just some things to think about, really. And one of the things that we wanted to mention was just around inclusion actually being a competitive advantage. And so it's not beneficial just for teams, obviously it's beneficial for organisations as well. And Bonnie St. John is an American former Paralympic skier. And she had her right leg amputated below the knee when she was 5 years old. But despite some of the challenges around not necessarily being included and that kind of thing, she still went on to excel as an athlete. And her view is that actually if the team did not have her, they simply would not have won as many medals as they did. So inclusion was about winning to her. So it's that competitive advantage, really, and it can provide some really intangible benefits that organisations might not even be aware of when they implement diversity and inclusion initiatives. So we just wanted to share that with you because we thought that was quite an interesting story, really. There's lots of benefits that I'm sure you're all aware of. You all have inclusion and diversity policies and programmes and initiatives in place, and it'd be brilliant again just keep sharing some of that in the chat because I think it's useful to see what your colleagues are doing. But actually, according to we've sort of looked at some of the research around this, and there's a collection of studies that reveal the real impact that inclusivity can have on organisations. So you can see, for example, there 17% increase in perceived team performance, for example, increases in decision-making quality, collaboration, financial targets, which we all have within the NHS, being able to perform at a higher level, 6 times more likely to be adaptive and innovative, and that's particularly important as we're starting to move into that ICS and ICB and system working space, really. So being able to have that inclusive approach, there's so many benefits with that, and obviously these will all ultimately impact on patient care and health inequalities as well. So it's really important to think about that. And obviously Michael West has done a lot of research around this, and we took, if anybody came to the compassionate leadership session that we did a couple of weeks ago, we talked a lot around this. But our every interaction really shapes our world. So think about what we're paying attention to, how do we present ourselves, how are we interacting, because that can all really have that impact on not just our colleagues but ultimately patient care as well. And think about, what do some of your stats say as well? I know somebody mentioned earlier, actually, one of the reasons that people leave is because you don't have that sense of belonging. What's some of the workforce data? And again, feel free to share this in the chat, but what are you noticing through your workforce data, whether that's your staff survey data, whether that's absence, what career progression, talent management, appraisals, what is that data telling you about potentially some of the issues with some of this? And we know that it's really important that our organisations reflect the diversity of the community in which they work. And these statistics are from the CIPD. But again, they're not, you'll find similar statistics if you're looking at your own workforce data, what your staff survey data is telling us. We were working with an NHS organisation quite recently who found through their staff survey that people from an ethnic minority background were more likely to say that career progression had failed them, and they didn't see they had those opportunities in place. And when we correlated that with some information through our talent tool, we found that a lot of people from an ethnic minority had put themselves in a category called flourish, which was, I'm happy where I am, I don't necessarily want to progress into another role. But actually, was it that they didn't want to progress, or did they see some barriers there? So it just presented the data in a way that enabled that organisation to think about that differently. This is quite an interesting one as well. I don't know if we've got anyone named David or Steve on the call today. But again, this is the number of chief execs in the FTSE 100. You can see there that there's more people named David or Steve than there are women in those top roles as well. So you can see that it's not just a challenge for a local level, but sort of nationwide and across the world, really, when you look at some of those statistics. So, and the problem is that the way that we currently approach performance and talent management isn't inspiring at all, really. And our unconscious bias can greatly affect that. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. And you might be familiar with some of this, but these 3 statements really hit me when I saw them, because it's diversity is having a seat at the table, so it's almost counting heads. Inclusion is making the heads count. So, okay, I've got a seat at the table, but now I've got a voice at the table. But our bias and spotting bias is a skill that we need to develop, and that's why some voices are heard more than others. And it's something that really creeps into our lives, both personally and professionally. The first step in the process is to admit that we have bias, because like it or not, as Sue said, we all do. We're hardwired to have it, whether we like it or not. And that comes from our own experience and things that we've been exposed to. And the problem is that these biases do tend to be unconscious. So the small everyday behaviours that happen outside of our awareness. So it's often easier to see biases in other people rather than in ourselves. So it's important that we're able to raise our self-awareness and start to recognise when we're seeing these biases play out. It might be in recruitment decisions, for example. And the biases we have not been developed intentionally, but it doesn't mean that we can't or we shouldn't do something about them. There are actually 150 biases in the world. I should have asked you to guess, shouldn't I, how many you thought there were? But to me, that sounded quite a lot. And to name a couple, there's similarity bias, which Sue mentioned earlier. So you're drawn to people that are like you and have similar experiences. Another one is experience bias. How many of us tend to rely on the same people at work to deliver things for us because we just know that they can. They've done it before and we know that we can trust them to deliver it. And then distance bias, I mentioned earlier, for people that are working remotely. But it's about creating real conditions of trust and psychological safety and allowing diverse teams to bring their unique perspectives to the table. We have got we're not going to go through all 150 biases, but we have got a guide that tells you a little bit more about bias, which we'll share with you in the chat at the end. So it's a resource that you can take away, and it'll include some of the key points from today as well. But one of the things I mentioned at the start was I'd like you to, I'll give you a minute just to have a look, have a read through these statements. And what we'd like you to do is click the raise your hand button if you've ever thought any of the following. So we'll see how we get on. I think for me, I don't want to go team bowling is quite an interesting one. Sometimes you feel that pressure, particularly if you're an introvert or you don't particularly want to socialise with your colleagues at work. There's that pressure, oh, come on, let's go out for a drink, and or let's go bowling. And that can sometimes feel the pressure for people. So we've got 24, 27, numbers are going up in terms of who's got their hands raised. If you're feeling brave, please do share any examples in the chat if you want to. You can speak up as well. I just know there's a lot of people on the call, so I don't want you to feel intimidated. It's got 38 people have raised their hands so far. Oh, V, I'm sorry you can't see the slides. There's just some statements on there, and it's things like, I feel like I've been set up to fail, or I don't feel like I fit in, or they never ask about me, don't feel trusted, they don't treat me the same, I can't get it all done, I feel overlooked. So lots of comments in there. So again, we've got 41 people that have raised their hands now, which is quite a lot. And as I said, if anyone does feel comfortable sort of sharing those experiences of when you felt like that, please feel free to do so. But it just shows you that actually feeling excluded is always there for anybody, no matter what's going on. And it's so easy to feel a little bit excluded based on the behaviours of other people. And some examples on there that we've got. So I just made a point, and now someone with a louder voice has taken the credit. Oh, how frustrating is that when you're thinking it and somebody else says it and you think, oh, that's so frustrating, or somebody else takes your idea forward that you've come up with. So that can be really frustrating. And again, people feeling like they haven't fitted in particular, if they come from a particular background as well. So that can feel, you can feel excluded depending on your socio-economic background. The team WhatsApp app that not all the team are included in. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? So what's going on there if not everyone's included? Was it a choice, or have people been purposefully excluded? That drinking culture, I think that similar to the don't want to go team bowling one, you know, if everyone's going out for a drink and actually I don't drink, so there's that real culture, and you, again, it's a way that you can feel excluded, and again, none of that might be intentional. So it's recognizing when we do it as well. I'm sure there's times as an extrovert myself when I've spoken above somebody else or I've not listened to somebody, but equally I've felt some of these myself as well. So it's just some of those little things that you sometimes don't realize are happening, that we tend to experience. And it's that intent versus impact, isn't it, as well? So if we just think about the difference between intent and impact. So our effectiveness as inclusive leaders lives in the impact of our actions, not our intent. So micro inequalities are tiny little differences that can add up over time that make you feel less confident or might affect your career progression, for example. So it's like a paper cut. Okay, when you get one, oh, it's a little thing, a little bit annoying, but imagine the pain of 1,000 paper cuts. So all these micro inequalities, or when you're feeling you've been excluded, can all add up. So I was trying to think of an example, really. There's one quite recently, actually, which let me just stop sharing a minute. I'll reshare in a moment, but there was one that I was thinking of, and if you can think of any more examples, please do pop them in the chat. But so my business partner Nicola and I were going on this session with the Business Growth Hub that was all about developing your business and that kind of thing. And Nicola was on holiday at the time, so I went along, and there was a man running the session, and he was doing some introductions, and he came to me and he said, "Oh, tell me a little bit about Delve." So I was sharing a little bit about Delve, and I said, "Oh, my business partner's on holiday at the moment." And I think it was when the World Cup was on or something, and he automatically assumed that my business partner was male and said, "Oh, has he gone to Portugal to watch the World Cup?" And I just said, "No, she hasn't. She's not really into football." But again, it was just that assumption that somebody made that just instantly kind of got my back up a little bit, and the intention wasn't there. And I'm sure I've done things like that myself, but the impact on it was just like, I didn't even want to be in that session anymore because it annoyed me that much. And so it's just sometimes thinking about how unintentionally people's impacts are. And things like a couple of other things are around scheduling team meetings on days when some people don't work. And again, it might be unintentional, but actually that impacts just makes somebody feel completely excluded. So those inequalities, just little micro cues are so important just to be aware of. So I'll just share my screen again. I just wanted to mention this statistic that you've got up there, around 70%. So this is about people leaving, or the impacts that a manager can have on a team member, and it's 70% of a difference as to whether an individual feels included depends on what leaders say and do. So that impact of managers, and you all know, you're thinking about exit interviews and things like that, you'll find that a lot of people leave because of the manager, and that makes such a big difference, really. So it's thinking about what can we do to support people in the right way. Something else just to consider as well is thinking about cognitive diversity. So when we're talking about inclusion, it's not just about counting heads to fill a quota. It also includes that cognitive inclusion as well. So cognitive diversity is where we've got people who have different thinking, different views, different skills and experiences that they can bring to the team. And Matthew Syed has written a few books you'll have heard of, like Black Box Thinking is one of them, but Rebel Ideas is about the importance of cognitive diversity as well as demographic diversity. So when you're working on new ideas, thinking about who are the voices that we're not hearing from, but not just paying lip service to it. Because and just to give you an example, I was working with a local authority a couple of years ago now, but they were exploring the success for new children and families working group. So they thought about who they wanted to invite. They'd invited all of the right people, schools, police, health, obviously social care as well. So they sort of thought about who needs to be in the room. They thought about the location as well. So they did it in a children's and family centre, a children's centre. And they thought, oh, we need the voice of the young person in the room as well. So they invited Katie, who was 16, along. But again, interestingly, and it comes back to some of what you were saying earlier, tended to be the voices that spoke loudest that were heard in that room. So whilst they'd invited Katie along, were they really inviting her in to talk? And at one point they were talking about drugs, and police had a view in terms of what they were seeing on the streets. Schools had a view in terms of what they were seeing in schools, and health obviously had a view in terms of what was coming through A&E. And Katie had a completely different view, and was trying to get a voice heard. And it was only when we sort of picked this up and highlighted, actually, let's hear from Katie as well, and having to draw her into that conversation as a facilitator, that people did start to listen. So again, sometimes you think you're doing all the right things and having the right people in the room, but actually, are you really listening to those people? So it's a good book. Somebody's mentioned it on there. It is a great read, so do have a look at that. But it's how we make some of those small nudges, really, to think about what can we do to change habits and behaviour. And something else just to really think about is it is a little bit like having two sides of the brain. So you've got one side of the brain, and this is from psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who gives this analogy of an elephant, which I quite like, really. But if you think about the brain, it's got two systems with a very different size and influence on behaviour. So the unconscious mind is almost like a 6-ton elephant, and the conscious and rational mind is like its rider. So the rider understands the business case, they understand why inclusion is so important, but can only attempt to steer us in the right direction. We need to really appeal to the elephant, which uses a completely different language and needs to be framed in a way to focus on some of those unconscious biases. So what really needs to happen is that fundamental redesign of our organisations. We might have the right policies in place, but how can we address the bigger picture in terms of that culture? And new ideas are often excluded because the human mind doesn't feel comfortable with the unfamiliar. So we recognise that knowledge that is familiar to us is more valid. We recognise people that look like us who are part of our tribe. And because of this, we've actually designed our organisations and even our societies in a way that excludes rather than includes. So it really wastes that human potential. So something to think about and as well. Then we want to hear from you. So please type in the chat. What are some of the things that you're doing to develop ourselves and our teams to recognise and interpret patterns of unconscious bias? So it's not an easy question, but I'd love to hear if you've got any ideas or some things that are working already for you within your own organisations that you'd be happy to share. And then we'll also share some information with you that you might find useful in starting to reframe that a little bit. But what good practice have you got? Because it's really important to build and teach skills for you inclusive leaders and to almost unlearn those old ways and old habits and thinking. We can all care about this and want to make a difference, but actually if we're not skilled and our leaders aren't skilled in this, they'll not be equipped to deal with the complexity of inclusion and diversity. So what are you already doing within your organisations? Please feel free to type in the chat, or if you do want to come off mute, feel free to do that as well. What are some of the things that you're already doing to address some of this? Any thoughts? I'm sure there are some great examples out there. Need to give everyone a chance to have a think and contribute to that chat. There's something as well, just while you're thinking about that, around that emotional intelligence, and that almost leaders having that emotional intelligence to have that self-awareness, really, that actually they do need to make a change and recognizing the impact that their behavior might have on other people. And some of that might be giving feedback. Got a couple of things coming through on the chat as well. So we've got a really great fairness and inclusion programme, which brilliant, covers a lot of the content that we're talking about today and how this applies in practice. So hopefully this is just a bit of a refresh. I think talking about it with colleagues as well, not just, don't talk about elephants again, but don't ignore the elephants in the room. Being able to talk about it is really important. We've got a cultural ambassador programme to support staff from ethnic minority backgrounds at interviews and employee relations hearings. Brilliant. Some real practical things there as well. Lots of staff networks. I'm sure you've all got lots of staff networks such as BAME, disability awareness, that kind of thing, which are all really important. I remember once in a previous role when I worked in the NHS, having a member of the team who was a wheelchair user, and I tried to get him to come to the Disability Awareness Network, but he didn't want to because he felt he actually felt the opposite of what it was designed to do. He felt a little bit singled out by going. So I had just asked him for some general feedback in another way. Some of the feedback that he gave, again, was something really practical, but it was about the toilets. And actually, it's a pedal bin in the toilets. If you wash your hands and dried your hands on a paper towel, actually, I can't use that pedal bin because I can't put my foot on it to put it in the bin. So just staff networks and that kind of thing get some real practical things that you don't always think about. Nobody intentionally put those bins in there to, exclude anybody, but actually that's the impact that it had. Spending time listening and reflecting on each of the journeys. There's a really great activity that you can do actually, which is basically just where you share your career journey. Just take 5 minutes, you can draw it out on a piece of paper, but share your journey so far, and you can go back as far as you want, primary school if you want to, however far you want to go back. But just share your journey, and I guarantee, even if it's a colleague that you work with closely, you'll learn so much about that person as an individual. So unconscious bias training, again, staff networks, inclusive career development program, fantastic. Reciprocal mentoring. I was talking to somebody actually who had that in place at their trust, who was an executive member, and they'd found that really, really beneficial. And in terms of that reverse mentoring as well. So being mentored from somebody in the organisation who wasn't at that exec level was really beneficial. Some great examples there, and things like focus groups as well. So have a read through the chat. There's lots of good examples in there that people are already using, which is fantastic.
So just looking through the chat and looking through all your comments, I think we all understand that it's not enough to simply just hire diversely. Look at this comparison. If diverse groups are mismanaged, then they will fail royally, right? So in this comparison, you can see different team performance of diverse groups that are well managed, non-diverse groups that are well managed, and diverse groups that are mismanaged. The whole point is that we must be intentional in embracing and moving towards the differences. On one hand, diverse groups might take a little time to get there because it does take time to build trust, but diverse groups expect their thinking to be challenged because they know that they're going to be different perspectives. So their arguments will be better prepared and more vigorously prepared, and they will achieve better results. Just to clarify what we mean by well managed, it could be something as simple as building in structure in a team meeting. It could be something like, oh, think about one reason why this decision will work and one reason why it won't work. The point is to question your perception and think and try to see things differently. We really want to incorporate reflection activities throughout your day. So let's think about what lies in our influence. As individuals, we can each work towards facilitating belonging and inclusivity for people around us. This is the Inclusive Leadership Development Model by Megan Pollock, and we just wanted to use it, and we'll go through a few steps to think about what we can control. So step 1 in this model is looking inwards at yourself. To be an equitable and inclusive leader, one must understand how their identities inform and bias their perceptions. Recognizing the power of your personal lens means understanding your positionality, the social and political context that creates your identity, and how your identity influences and biases your perception and outlook of the world. We want to check, recognize, and engage with your biases. Really question your instinctual and quick reactions, your decisions, and your first impressions. The thing is, when you're a part of a majority, whether it is race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, religion, language, disability, or even some of the things you mentioned in the chat, like people who are introverts rather than extroverts, who have different opinions to us, who come from different experiences, socioeconomic statuses, different family situations, and different educations, or even different generations. If you're part of a majority, the way that your group's way of doing things gets built into your system and your culture. It gets institutionalized, normalized, and made invisible. And it just becomes the culture of the way it is. It's always been this way. It gets built for you. But it's a very different story if you're a part of a minority group. In a minority group, you consciously make an effort to fit, adapt the way that you act or speak so that the majority does not think of you as a potential threat, going back to our earlier slides, and so that it does not affect whether your idea is heard, people's decisions about your competence that might be affected by their unconscious bias, so that it doesn't affect your career, whether you get that job or promotion or your future generations to come. So these are just a few questions to really reflect on and think about, in what ways are we inviting dialogue that collectively expands social consciousness and explains how our identities bias our perceptions and outlook to the world. We also want to encourage you to go one step further than this model and be a mirror to somebody else and listen to their experiences and make them feel heard, seen, and valued. Step 2 is looking out to develop social consciousness. It is a skill to recognize barriers, develop systemic thinking, and interpersonal and institutional dilemmas of bias. Use your social consciousness to see the world differently. So again, a few questions to reflect on. How are we considering institutional barriers that marginalized and minoritized people face in the workplace? How are we actively working to remove obstacles and supplant them with support? And in what ways are we establishing guardrails to protect us from biases in our decisions, policies, and practices? So what do you do after you recognize your personal, organizational, or systemic sore spots? Step 3 is to take action through a human-centered approach by becoming an accountable, lifelong learner. Function by taking a strengths-based approach to truly value diversity and develop an appreciation for people who talk, look, and think differently from us. It takes a conscious effort to develop the skill to unlearn functioning from a deficit mindset that we spoke about earlier, where you use your past experiences to connect the dots via assumptions in your current reality, to instead seeing differences as an asset instead of a potential threat. So in doing so, you're trying to make that shift from a deficit mindset to a growth mindset. As our social consciousness expands, we must be accountable to model this growth mindset and practice it. So again, a few more questions to really reflect on that. How are we practicing visible accountability for mistakes and our mindsets? Step 4. What we mean by practice is taking action based on our new learnings of how other people experience the world. Communication and collaboration are key elements that make up the culture or an environment and impact that sense of belongingness. So having an inclusive culture allows people from the minority group to authentically engage and contribute and to feel supported and psychologically safe while doing so. So again, a few questions for you to reflect on. How are we evaluating and refreshing our team norms so that more people can authentically engage? So now, before I hand over to Sarah, she's going to talk us through a little bit of psychological safety. This is an activity that Thomas Falk uses on his direct report to really demonstrate that step 1 that we spoke about, holding up a mirror to look inwards at yourself. So I'm going to ask you to quickly do this now. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. Please write down the names of people who have made a difference to your career. So who are the people who gave you your first break or took a chance on you or saw some potential that you might not have seen yourself? So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to write down a few names. You can give us a thumbs up if you've completed it. Right. Step 2, please write down the names of people who have written down your name to answer question 1. Again, you can give us a little thumbs up. Now, what I would like for you to do is, and you don't necessarily have to share this with us, but look at the names by yourself and really reflect on, is there anybody, if you have 5 people on the list, out of the 5 people, how many of them do not look or think like you? Now, there is no judgment or no conclusions that can be drawn from this alone, but this was just his way to make it really personal, to demonstrate that need to be able to embrace and bring along all kinds of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. I think it's a really interesting activity to do, and another way that you can do that and look at it is if you had to think about who your top 5 trusted people are that you would perhaps talk to, share things with outside of your family, and again explore that and think about how diverse is my top 5, because it's quite interesting when you do it, and again it's just a thing to get you thinking and reflecting on that, and something that you can take away and ask other people to do as well. So we've just got a couple more things that we want to share with you in terms of just some practical actions really that you can take, and it's really important to us at any session we do. It gives you some practical tips, so that's what we want to do and share with you, and hopefully you've got some already. But firstly, when you hear the term psychological safety, what does that mean to you? And again, feel free to type in the chat when you think about psychological safety, what does it actually mean? Been lots of research around psychological safety, particularly Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety and having that environment actually where people believe that if they make a mistake, others won't think less of them. They also believe that others won't resent or humiliate them if they ask for help. So that's what it looks like from Amy Edmondson's viewpoint. And thinking about that psychological safety, the belief that comes about when people both trust and respect each other, and you've got that real sense of confidence, and the group won't embarrass somebody for speaking up. And it's sometimes a taken for granted belief about how others will respond when you ask a question, or when you seek feedback, or admit a mistake, or propose an idea that you might think is a little bit wacky. So it isn't about a cozy club where everybody's best friends, but it's about thinking around what does that look like in terms of psychological safety, and it's taken for granted when it's there, and actually you notice it a lot more when it's missing. So just some of the things that you can do to create that feeling of psychological safety within your own teams, or wider within that. So making sure everyone has clear goals, whether that's a team vision or a team objective, but also individual goals as well. Ensuring staff people feel heard and appreciated, and when we say heard, it's not just a case of listening. If anyone came to the compassionate leadership session, we talked about the 5 levels of listening, which range from level 1, where you're probably not listening, you're just thinking about what you need to pick up from Tesco on your way home, or something else that you need to be doing instead of having this conversation, and level 5 is that real intuitive listening, where you're listening between the lines and almost hearing what isn't being said, and it takes a lot of practice. But there is a difference between listening and hearing. Making work challenging, not threatening. So as I said, it's not a cozy club, it's making sure people have the right stretch opportunities. You've got that right balance between support and challenge. And creating a culture where it's okay to make mistakes. Let's try something. It's fine if it doesn't work, but that it's okay to feel okay to admit that and learn from it. And you've got that real shared sense of purpose as well. And it's almost creating environments where diversity of thought is the currency of inclusion. So being aware of psychological safety is so important. I was just having a look at the chat there, because thanks for sharing the comment around people that have influenced your career over the years don't look like me, but have made a marked difference in my life and career, and being thankful to them as well. And just another note, if you have written people down that you think, actually I haven't thanked them, make the time to do, even if it was years ago. I'm sure they'd appreciate that. Thinking about those things that you can be grateful for as well. But lots of things that we can do around inclusive leadership, and this is something to think about when we champion change and developing those skills really. But some of the things that really make a difference are authenticity and accountability. So being an inclusive leader isn't someone who simply talks about how passionate they are about diversity and inclusion, for example, but takes responsibility and holds themselves to account for living and breathing inclusivity, and takes responsibility for their individual actions. You've got humility on there. Creating that space for others to contribute is really important. So again, there are some leaders who say they're inclusive, but actually when they chair a meeting, are they letting other people get a word in edgeways? And again, start to observe this in practice. It's so important that we're creating that psychologically safe place, and Getting contributions from people that don't normally speak. And that's not about putting people on the spot. You might have to find another way to engage with that person. They might not feel comfortable speaking up in that meeting, but what else can you do? Self-awareness, again, which we've touched on, and showing that real genuine concern and curiosity, being curious about other people. Somebody shared about sharing your journey and just finding out more. It only takes 5 minutes to do that. Cultural and emotional intelligence, again, we've touched on. But recognizing when somebody might be struggling, don't call this out in front of others, make time to have a separate conversation, really. And effective collaboration as well. So again, leaders talk about this, and it's what we should all be doing, especially working in that system space. But again, we've mentioned it, a couple of people have said that taking credit for other people's ideas, that's not really collaboration, is it? So really, it's all about being genuine and authentic. And there are things that you can do, and we've broken it down really into 2 things. And this is all on the handout that we'll share with you in the chat in a moment. But there's inclusion nudges that you can do when you're having one-to-one conversations with individuals. And it's making time for quality conversations really is the key one. So enabling people to bring the whole selves to work and feel able to talk to your leaders about issues that might be impacting them outside of work, creating the right conditions for trust and psychological safety. People able to share what's going on for them, and hopefully having that kind of approach and developing our leaders to be those kind of people will result in less formal proceedings and less people having to put grievances in because they're not getting the voices heard, for example. Listening to understand, which we've talked about, having that open mind as well, thinking about what that looks like, and being innovative really about some of these things, making real conscious decisions, not unconsciously excluding people. Think about being aware of who you're providing opportunities to at work. Ensure that the same people aren't being selected all of the time. Opportunity to rotate those job opportunities, cast nets wider, make the time to really find out about people's ambitions. Are people going for promotions? And if not, is it because they're happy in the role that they're in, or are there some barriers there for certain underrepresented groups, for example? And recognise how you're asking for feedback and recognising how you're praising and giving feedback to other people as well. So reflect on that. Are you praising people evenly? Have you ever been the recipient of a message along the lines of, thank you for responding so quickly, but... So think about how you're praising people. Don't use but, use and. Think about the way that you're giving feedback to other people. And then thinking about including nudges in groups, it's really about that opportunity to create different spaces and events and networks, which it sounds like you're all doing anyway, but for people to connect in different ways. Not everyone drinks, not everybody wants to go team bowling. Think about your social activities that are being organised. What does that look like? And think about how we can change groupthink to diversity of thought, because again, if you've got lots of people that are speaking loudly in a room and one person has an idea and then another extrovert goes, yeah, that's a great idea, and then there's a couple of people in the room going, I'm not sure that is a great idea, but I don't feel able to challenge it, you quickly get groupthink, which completely abolishes anything creative or innovative that we're trying to do. So try and think about how you can do that. Think about, do you always consult the same sounding boards, the same people in your list when you need to make decisions? Try and pick some different people to get that different perspective. Think about using non-verbal cues in meetings as well. So, notice when somebody might have something to say or they want to come in, and actively drawing them into that conversation, and seek opportunities outside of the meeting as well for people. Just because someone's quiet doesn't mean they don't have something to say. Giving people opportunity to think things through. We tend to do problem solving together a lot, but actually some people, and I know I do like talking things through, I know I do, I am an extrovert, but sometimes I'll have my best ideas, at 3 a.m. or go for a walk one day, and it's giving people that space to think things through before they come together. So you're avoiding that group think as well is really important. Pay attention to the language used, and this isn't just in terms of thinking about the kind of language that might exclude people, but also are you using nicknames for people? Are you excluding people because they're perhaps not part of the in crowd, for example? When introducing colleagues, do you give the same level of detail? So for example, if I'm introducing Sue, I'm going to say, this is Sue. Sue and I go way back. She's a brilliant member of the team, and this is Tracy. And yeah, you know, so think about how you're introducing people. Are you giving them the same kind of introduction? Because that's really, really important to do, that same level of detail. Avoid giving that glowing introduction for one person and then introducing another person by just the name like I did, because it can have that real impact on somebody. So those again, just some tips. And I think the key thing is just, you know, we're not always going to get it right. Apologise if we do get it wrong. Part of creating that authenticity is showing yourself to be human, asking for feedback. You are going to make mistakes. We all are, but it's that willingness to accept them and change, and that can create that real cultural shift. So we've come to the end of the session. Sue, are you okay just to pop in the chat the link? Because we've got a bit of a resource pack that we're going to share with you that talks through all the different biases and some of the content from today's session. But with 2 minutes left, has anyone got any final thoughts, or is anything that's really resonated with you, a non-inclusive practice that you're going to challenge going forward? Any thoughts? Let me just stop sharing a minute.
Ursula's just put in the chat there that she sent individual emails to each of her team members with feedback about how they've supported her.
Fantastic. Any thoughts, give us a shout. But we've come to the end of the session, so hopefully we've given you something to take away. I've just popped in the chat, there's a link that you can click on there that will take you to a resource pack that you can download. It's got all of the info from today in it, and also lots of info on bias as well, and the different types. But thank you very much. Tracy, is there anything you wanted to finish off with?
I just want to say one thank you, rather than a warm welcome, a warm thank you at the end to everybody who's joined us today, and to yourself and to Sue as well. I think, you know, the session of an hour has been packed full of information. So I'm sure people could do with the opportunity to go and download at some point pretty quick. Whether that be, I won't make assumptions, it might be a cup of tea, it might be a glass of water, it might be something else, whatever you feel would be best for you. So a massive thank you to you all once again. It was another great session. And thank you to colleagues. There's been a lot of sharing in the chat today, and I think that's great to see. And it just creates that added dimension, doesn't it, to this type of a facility. So evaluation forms will be winging their way to you in the next day or so. Please complete them and send them back to us, along with any other thoughts or ideas for further sessions. But take care, everybody, and have a great afternoon. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.